Hello, everyone. It is so exciting to see so many boxes on my screen and so many faces from far and wide. It's really a tremendous opportunity we have here. So thank you so much for tuning in. I am Erin Leib Smokler. A word of background. I am physically on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. But like Adi, I like to spend some time in the Berkshires whenever I can. That is my soul's home these days, but though I live here. I teach at Yeshivat Maharat, a rabbinical school here in New York, but also caters now to an international group of women. And I have been learning and teaching Chassidut for quite some time now. I wrote my PhD on the Piazetzner Rebbe, who is the Rebbe known as the Rebbe of the Warsaw Ghetto, a slightly more contemporary figure than we'll be looking at, but have a long interest in a lineage that built up to him, shall we say. And so I'm really excited to share with you over the course of the next number of months or however long you join us for, but I hope you'll come back. We will be studying together the Sfat Emet. So just a word of intro on who that is that we'll be looking at. The Sfat Emet is the Ger Rebbe, meaning a Rebbe from the town of Gur or Ger, which is near Warsaw. His name was Rabbi Yehuda Leib Alter, or Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Leib Alter, as he is sometimes known. And he lived from 1847 to 1905. He was mostly raised by his grandfather, who was the founder of this line of Chassidut, the Gerer Hasidim. His grandfather's name was Rabbi Yitzchak Meir Rothenberg, also known as the Chidushei Harim. His grandfather was a very accomplished Talmudist and legal scholar, and also a Hasidic master. And that combination is not always to be found. So that combination of kind of scholarship in the Talmudic tradition and the more mystical teachings of Hasidut, that is the inheritance into which our Rebbe is born and raised. He references his grandfather all the time. As we will see over the course of studying together, he was not only his primary caretaker, father figure, because he was orphaned young, but also truly his mentor. This may or may not be important for some of you, but the grandfather, Rabbi Yitzchak Meir, was a sort of comes from the line of the Kutzker Rebbe. Kutzker Rebbe is known for real kind of we'll say, quest for truth that sometimes can be quite harsh. Sfat Emet has the word emet or truth in it. And some say that this book in part is a response to or an attempt to kind of soften and give language to some of that more sharp quest for truth that is associated with his own Kutzker line of Hasidism. This Rebbe, like many Rebbes, gave talks every Shabbat, usually in Yiddish, written down in Hebrew. And what we have today as the book, the Sfat Emet, which is translated by Art Green as the language of truth, is a compilation of his writings from 1830, I want to say. Is that right? That doesn't make any sense. No. So no. Sorry. I'm sorry. He served from the Rebbe of his community from 1871 to 1905. So during the course of that, these Torah, these sermons, I suppose, were given. He didn't collect them in this specific volume, but he very much wanted his writings to be published, and his students did that for him posthumously. Okay, so a few things to note about the kind of the structure of the book, and of what we'll do too, is that he speaks every week on the parsha. And what we have is actually kind of dated versions year to year, right? So it's like whoever your hometown rabbi is, right? Everything that rabbi has said over the past 30 years on Breshit, and then on, on and on Noach, Lech Lecha, etc. Right? So that's what we have here. And what's kind of fun and interesting is to see how he will oftentimes reflect on the very same verse year after year after year after year, which I like to tell my rabbinical students is very inspiring, I hope, because it just, you can use the same material over and over and over and over again, and it need not get old, because he does offer new teachings frequently on the same material, meaning choosing the same verse to comment on, or the same midrash that he wants to bring in. He'll do that year after year. In our time together, we will likely only have time to focus on one teaching per our learning sessions. But where relevant, I can point out the ways in which he is reworking tropes over and over again. And like a good Hasidic Rebbe, oftentimes he's doing so to help internalize, privatize, we can say that, individualize. I know I'm kind of making up words here, but take teachings that seem abstract and abstruse and to engage them in a way that helps us see them as expressions of and ways to cultivate internal kind of awareness, mindfulness, and awakening to spirituality. And so the teaching that we're going to look at today is one of his opening teachings on, of course, the opening book of the Torah, the opening parsha of the Torah, which is Breshit. And it is both in and of itself, I think, a beautiful teaching, but also helps to give us the seeds of some of his kind of deeply characteristic themes that he will, and we will, hopefully develop over time. Okay, so I'm going to, I see that we have quite a few people, which is wonderful. So I'm just going to encourage you to ask questions in the chat. I'd love to hear your voices. I don't know how realistic that is with 90 plus people. So for today, or for now, let's try this. Please put questions, comments, anything you want me to address in the chat. Truly, my ideal way of teaching is really learning from all of you. I don't prefer to just talk. So please interrupt me in a quiet and nice way in the chat, and I will do my absolute best to try to monitor that. And we'll see how the time goes. If there's time, maybe we will be able to get some more voices in the room. But we're going to begin. Adi, if you can put the text up for everybody to see. We're going to start with the teaching. There you go, right, from 1870. So again, this is, just for what it's worth, I'm going to hold up the book that I have here so you can kind of just see what it looks like. And the teaching that we're doing is from his first year of preaching, which is 1870. This is technically the second teaching from that, which just means the second small paragraph. And in it, you'll see that he opens by referencing the first teaching, or the first commentary on the Torah by Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. right? So by way of background, I'm gonna actually, Adi, ask you to just go to the next page for a moment, where you'll see that Rashi. So I'm gonna just read this aloud. Thank you so much. We'll read this aloud so we have a sense of what he is commenting on. Okay, and I see there's a question which I'll address in a moment. Okay, so Rashi is himself bringing to us a midrash. Midrash in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak. That might be a little bit confusing. Rashi is Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. He's quoting Rabbi Yitzchak. These are two different characters, different times. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, lo hayat tzarich latzchil et haTorah ela me'achodesh hazeh lachem. So the question that Rashi brings in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak is, why does the Torah begin at the beginning? Or why does it begin here? Here meaning the story of creation, as opposed to what? And here Rabbi Yitzchak kind of shows his hand as to what he thinks the project of Torah is even about. And he says, shouldn't the Torah have begun with a law? With the first law, the law of establishing new months or new moons. As he says, Shehi mitzvah rishona shenitztavu ba'Yisrael, because this is the first law that was given to Israel. You might be thinking, really, is that true? What about all the other things I might have learned before then? But this is understood to be the first one given to the nation of Israel, as opposed to an individual. But the nation of Israel is to set a calendar at the new moon. Ma ta'am patach b'Breshit. So why does the Torah start in Breshit? Mishum koach ma'asav higid la'amo latet lahem nachalat goyim. That is a verse from Tehillim. You can just see the translation, or not, sorry, as on the screen, but I can just tell you. I don't want to get bogged down in it, but the statement is that essentially God, oh, nope, we lost it. There it is. Okay, God declared to God's people the strength of God's work, i.e. God gave an account of the work of creation in order that God might give them the heritage of the nations. You can scroll back up. We're not going to focus on that. That is just the proof text that Rabbi Yitzchak offers. There we go. Okay. She'im yomru umot ha'olam liYisrael listimatem shekavashtem artzot shiv'a goyim hem omrim lahem kol ha'aretz shel HaKadosh Baruch hu bara'a unetana la'asher yashar be'inav b'ratzono netana lahem u'b'ratzono netala mehem unetana lanu. So if you think that Jews have been arguing about politics only in our time, you can see that Rashi started by getting us immediately into the political. We will not engage in that here, but I'll just say that interestingly, Rabbi Yitzchak, way back when, suggested that the reason why the Torah started with creation was essentially for political reasons. So because to show that God created the land, and therefore God can essentially apportion the land as God wishes. This I bring to you as a kind of straw man to show you what the Rebbe, our Rebbe, Misfat Emet, does not engage in. So he quotes the question, he brings us this question of Rabbi Yitzchak, which is, why does the Torah start with creation? And he decidedly does not bring this political answer, but instead takes us in an entirely different direction. And what is that direction? Okay. So the where he takes us, and now we can maybe scroll way back up to the beginning where we will stay for a while. Okay. So he asks this question of why did the Torah start with the story of creation? And he says, he says, let's try to understand what all of these stories, verses are doing from the creation story all the way until essentially the introduction of legalism, right? Until HaChodesh Hazeh, which is the new month. What's going on from, like, essentially, what's all the narrative about? Why is it there? So again, I want to suggest to you that when Rabbi Yitzchak gives his political answer, he is telling us something about certainly his worldview, but his Torah view, his view, what Torah itself is about, right? On the one hand, it's about law. That's the presupposition underlying the question itself, right? Which assumes that this book should have opened up in a legal way, right? And then he gives us some politics, which Sfat Emet would rather do without. So the Sfat Emet says instead, Ach perush hadavar ki af sheikar haTorah lemitzvoteha ne'emar ze Torah shebichtav. I'm going to do this a little bit outside of the text because that's a little wordy. He says, you're right, Rabbi Yitzchak. The law is very important. But I want to tell you something else. And he begins to describe the nature of Torah as he understands it. And he does so using a language that is available to him through the rabbinic tradition, which is a distinction made between Torah shebichtav, understood to be the written tradition, and Torah shebe'al peh. So just a word about that. So again, what I'm calling the traditional rabbinic perspective, that which is represented in this case in the Talmud, is that the Torah shebichtav, the written Torah, is usually referring to the 5 books of Moses, right? The written word. And Torah shebe'al peh, which means Torah of the mouth, right, or spoken Torah, is all the commentary that was written on top of it. And there's all kinds of discussions throughout our intellectual, literary, and spiritual history about sort of what constitutes Torah shebe'al peh. Is it anything that we, even into contemporary times, say? Is it new? Is it material that was actually itself spoken at Sinai? This is one of the views that's represented in the Talmud as well, right? That all that ever was to be from Torah was already, latent at Sinai, or maybe even spoken at Sinai, but would sort of be unraveled or revealed over time, but was all situated there. Again, these are all kind of traditional views, but the Sfat Emet introduces something, I think, quite different. And he says the Torah shebichtav, or written Torah, is circumscribed to the legalities alone. Essentially, Rabbi Yitzchak's Torah is the written Torah. But the oral Torah, or Torah shebe'al peh, he says, is something that is actually created by human beings. And that the story of creation is situated at the beginning of our collective human Jewish story, because creation and creativity itself is what Torah is about. I'm going to say that again, and then I'm going to read it inside a little bit, because his language is beautiful, though it is a bit dense. But right, the written Torah, he limits. It's a small part of what we might otherwise call, right, the 5 books of Moses, or the Tanakh even, right? That the written Torah, is just a small part of that. But the rest of it, he says, all the narrative, all the stories of our forefathers and our foremothers is itself constitutive of Torah shebe'al peh, and is there to be the paradigm for the life and the mode of living that we ought to be formulating for ourselves in the present too. One more try, right? So the creation story is itself the paradigm for Torah, because Torah, or Torah living, is creative living. And it is specifically about the channeling, and here we'll say more about this in a moment, but the channeling of a kind of divine energy through the human being and into the world in a way that enlivens and kind of enriches it. We're going to look at it inside so we can be even clearer. Let me take a pause to just look at the comments. Okay, so the opening question was, would the Sfat Emet have thought about his work as a mindfulness practice? No, I don't think so. But it's certainly a lens through which we can, I think, with honesty, look at it. By which I mean the language itself of mindfulness would not be something that would be necessarily available to him, but to the degree that through his Hasidic inheritance, there's quite a bit of, again, internalizing, quieting, cultivating awareness, and you'll see it even in this small paragraph. I do think that it is authentically present in his own teaching and in his own practice too. But that frame itself would not be quite known to him. Okay, isn't it true that the translation of "in the beginning" isn't the true translation, of "in the beginning as we begin"? Yes, much has been said of the words "Bereshit bara Elokim." It can be translated as "in the beginning" or "from the beginning," "through the beginning." There's all kinds of ways of understanding that original "be" or "bet" rather. It's open to interpretation, and as we'll see here, the Sfat Emet opens it to an even broader sense of beginnings. So not only, so the beginning of the physical universe is a parallel enterprise to the beginning of kind of human creativity and the channeling of soul, I suppose, into the world, as we'll see. Okay, comment. Given that the nature of the universe has laws of its own, I'd imagine that creation and commandments aren't necessarily mutually exclusive concepts. Of course they're not. That's what we're going to get to. Okay, I'm not going to read every single one aloud. I'm going to look at them and respond to what I can. Okay, so one question here is from Linda W. Is the Torah in chronological order? So that's a great question. One that a lot of commentaries debate, and I think that what's profoundly interesting about just these opening lines from the Sfat Emet, right, is the claim here that chronology is not important, or chronology is not as important, let's say, as in a certain sense, let's say pedagogy or theology, you might say. Meaning, yes, it seems narratively reasonable to start a story at the beginning of the beginnings of the universe. But for the Sfat Emet, something else is going on here, which is the Torah for him. Remember, we said about Rabbi Yitzchak that the Torah of Rabbi Yitzchak is a Torah of law and or politics. But the Torah for the Sfat Emet, right, is a Torah of living. It's a Torah of creative living. So the aim of Torah, the frame of Torah, the way in which it comes into the world, it has to start in a place of creativity. So yes, it's literally a reference to creation of the world, but he's talking about the ways in which that itself is metaphor for the nature of the world itself, or particularly the nature of human life. And so in terms of this question of chronology, I'll also just point something out here, that there's, he does something that is subtly radical, which is that, again, the rabbinic understanding of Torah shebichtav versus Torah shebe'al peh implicitly always gives priority to Torah shebichtav, to the written word, with the kind of traditional assumptions that the written word is the godly word, and then Torah shebe'al peh, there are questions about whether they're divinely inspired or directly from God or not from God, and they are human, and therefore, again, insinuations of kind of second order importance. What I find very interesting about the Sfat Emet, and remember, this is from his it's not only the beginning of the Torah, but it's also the beginning of the Sfat Emet's work, right, is the prioritization of Torah shebe'al peh, literally in time. right? Because we were talking about chronology moments ago, right? Because if we say that the laws are the written word, or Torah shebichtav, they come later, right? Remember, the opening question is, why do we start the story here, right? And what the Sfat is saying is that the primary, let's say, form of Torah that we human beings need is Torah shebe'al peh. And that Torah shebe'al peh is something that we actually co-create. So I'm going to look at that inside because I've been indicating it without telling you where I was getting it from. Okay, so I'm going to look at the text itself. Forgive me for looking down. I just have it in front of me. He says, Aval Hashem Yitbarach. If you're following along, do your best. There are a lot of acronyms here that may or may not be known to you just from looking at them. So you can just try to follow along. So Hashem Yitbarach, for example, is right there. Hey Shin Yud Taf. Aval Hashem Yitbarach Ratzal Lebarer Ki Gam Olam Hazeh V'Chol Habriya Gam Ken Al Yedei Koach HaTorah. Kimo Shekatuv Bereshit Hebit B'Torah Ubara Olam. I'm going to go back. God wanted to clarify, Ratzal Levarer, that this world and all of its material creations, they too are Torah, or are made through the Koach HaTorah, the power of Torah. V'zehu inyan Torah shebe'al peh shetalui b'ma'aseh Adam. This Torah shebe'al peh is talui, is dependent upon the actions of human beings. B'zeh kol ha'parshiyot mima'aseh avot leharot ki na'aseh mima'asehem Torah. I just want to emphasize those words here. Na'aseh mima'asehem Torah. Okay, so before I explain that, I just want to say something structurally that might be a little bit confusing. The opening question that was posed, through Rashi was, why do we start with the story of creation? But the broader the broader view, or the broader kind of chunk of text that is being asked about is not only the creation story, but essentially everything that comes before HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, which is essentially not just the first verses of Breshit and not the first chapters of Breshit, but essentially the book of Breshit, essentially the whole book of Breshit. And the question is, what is it doing there? So then it becomes a question not only about the creation story, but also, again, the narratives of the patriarchs and matriarchs. So when he says here, Na'aseh mima'asehem Torah, he's talking about the literal actions that we will read about, haven't yet read, but will read about in the book of Breshit itself, the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Sarah and Rachel and Rebecca and Leah and their children, right? And all the dysfunction and all the joys and all the discoveries of God and all of the rebellions against God, all of that delightful, beautiful mess, right? That's what he is thinking about. What is the role of that? And he names that again, it's kind of jumble of deep humanity. That's Torah, he says. That's Torah shebe'al peh, that precedes, it seems, in time and arguably in importance, maybe, precedes Torah shebichtav, all the legal stuff. Human beings working out how to be human. Human beings working out how to be human in conversation with, or as they discover, try to make sense of, again, rebel against, / come closer to God, all of that. Na'aseh mima'asehem Torah. Torah is the human attempt to, in a sense, find God and to live a life that's somehow in direct relationship with divinity, the sacred, the holy, however you understand that. And so those words, Na'aseh mima'asehem Torah, I think are really central because, again, they make human lives, very human lives, into the very building blocks of Torah. Torah itself is not a reflection of, let me say that differently. The Torah that we have is not some kind of blueprint or template upon which we ought to build our own lives, but it is actually kind of constitutive of our lives. It is, or comprised of our lives. Now I'm making a jump here. He's certainly talking about the lives of the patriarchs and the matriarchs, but I'm extending it a little bit too. Make of that as you wish. But the claim here, right, is that out of human lives comes the stuff, the materials of Torah, or of spiritual life, you might say. And he says, Ve'al zeh, I lost my place 1 second. Ve'al shem zeh nikra ma'aseh breshit, lahagid ki ba'asara ma'amarot nivra ha'olam, shagam chiyut ha'olam al yedei ha'torah. Okay, I'm skipping a little bit because I don't want to stay so close to the text that we can't conceptualize a bit out of it. But I do want to note here, not only I was going to say a turn, it's not exactly a turn, but a way in which he now begins to highlight another thematic core. And really this is core to his own theology and spiritual practice. A notion here identified as chiyut. So chiyut, the Hebrew, has the word in it chai, life. I forget how Art Green, this is the Art Green translation, the English that you have here. I've been kind of doing my own as we go along here. So he translates it in a variety of ways, but I just, if there was a word in English for like lifefulness, I suppose you could say vitality, right? He's talking about the essence of life, the essence of life as it is manifest in the world. So I'm going to reread that sentence for a moment so that we can see where he's taking us. And what he does actually is he tries to build a kind of 3-part structure for how human life, or human life force, shall we say, relates to the divine, and how that force, or how both of those forces contribute to what he experiences to be a kind of life force in the external world itself. So again, there's a kind of chiyut, or chiyas, they say in some Hasidic speech. There's a chiyas that can be found within a human being that is itself a kind of channeling of a divine energy. Maybe we could use that word energy, right? And that when we channel that into the world, we actually give a kind of life force or vitality energy to the world itself. So he says, just the last few lines there, Shagam chiyut ha'olam al yedei ha'torah ve'avodat ha'adam livarer zeh shekol ma'aseh al yedei chiyut Hashem yitbarach. Ukshe'adam oseh ma'asav al pi koach ha'torah. All right, forget it. I'm not going to do the rest inside. We'll do it outside. Okay. So what he suggests here is that there is a completely synergistic relationship between human beings and, again, a kind of divine energy. Synergistic. We ourselves channel divine energy and vice versa. Whoa, what does it mean for God to channel human energy? Big question. But not an uncommon claim in a Hasidic worldview that really sees a reciprocal relationship between, again, human energies and divine energies. We take from the world and we give to the world. God gives to us and is shaped by us, let's say. I know I'm saying a lot of maybe abstract things, but I do, let's say, ask for your trust. I suppose that's a big ask on week 1, but he and I are seeding some ideas that he will continue to develop over time, and here's one of them. So if you don't totally get it right now, that's okay. Because we have like a lot of weeks to unpack and unpack and unpack. But just to get the concept out there, right? We have a notion of chiyut, a notion of vitality. That vitality is for him, for the Sfat Emet, sometimes referred to as the Sfas Emes, and I will go between those, so don't be confused. That actually gets located for him inside of the human being. Some might even say, right, within the body of the human being, as what he calls a nikuda, a point. Sometimes he'll refer to this as nikuda chiyut, sometimes, which is right, the point of lifefulness or the point of vitality within a human being. Sometimes he'll refer to this as nikudat hapnimiyut, which is the point of inwardness. Sometimes he just uses the word nikuda, and I'm sure there are others that I'm forgetting right now. But just to sort of scaffold what we've just said thus far, right? Opening question, why the story of creation at all, and all the narratives of our ancestors? Why are they the first stories that we hear? Why are they the first book that we hear in the Torah? Response, because it's actually what the Torah is. The Torah really is itself a manifestation of, an expression of the creative energy of the divine as it meets human beings. Torah as we know it, which he identifies as Torah sheba'al peh, or spoken, right? You can imagine it as breathed in Torah, Torah that has language. You could think of this as the safat emet. Safa means language, right? So the language of truth is itself built on an appreciation for language, an appreciation for the spoken word, for Torah sheba'al peh, what our mouths can produce and also what our bodies can do. And he says, Na'aseh mima'asehem Torah, that Torah is itself, again, a kind of reflection of this synergistic creativity between God and human beings. And that is what we live by, and that is what we continue, I think, to create. Next step, where do we find that synergy in our own lives? How does that become manifest? How does the metaphor of creation and the coming together of divine human energies get lodged in the contemporary human body, let's say? And that, he says, is the nikuda where we find chiyut. Where is it? What is it? So I'm going to read a little bit more, and then I'm going to pause for some reflections or questions. Okay, sorry, I got distracted by a question. My apologies. So I will just read from where I left off or thereabouts. Okay, actually, I'll just read the latter bolded part. He is reflecting on another verse that involves the word Sion. Sion might be familiar as a place, Zion, Jerusalem. But needless to say, the Sfat Emet does not choose to go the literal route, and instead says about Sion, Perush Sion hu hanikuda sheyesh bechol davar rishima ve'ot lizkor shehu me'Hashem yitbarach. So leaving aside the literary reference for a moment and how he gets here from Sion, it's a whole story unto itself. But he says, no, I lost you. Okay, stop. You're trying to get to the translation. My apologies. I'm sorry, Adi. I'm just translating it for myself here. But he says that הנקודה שיש בכל דבר רשימה ואות לזכור שהוא מהשם יתברך. There is a point within, and he says b'chol davar. We can sort of table that for further conversation, whether it's only human beings or all things, but we'll just talk about humans for now. There is a point in all humans that is a rishima ve'ot. Rishima or roshem in Hebrew is like an imprint. There's like an imprint or a memory of lizkor shehu me'Hashem yitbarach, for us to, or a reminder that we can say that we all, excuse me, are from or contain, right, some degree of holiness within. Or literally, there is a point in everything that is an imprint and a sign to remind us that we are of God. V'hu hachiyut shemechayeh chol davar. I'm hesitating because it's unclear whether this is itself a definition of what it is to be from God, or a definition of God. That would be a big statement. But I'll just say it this way, that the nikuda, or the point of divinity within, is hachiyut shemechayeh kol davar. The aliveness that gives life to all things. It's very clunky in my bad translation here, but I do think at least it is. It tries to get at the importance of this word chayim that I want you all to have a sense of from the original here. The hu hachiyut shemechayeh kol davar. It could be that what it is, that God's self is the energy that energizes all. And to tap into a nikuda, or that point within, which is the roshem, or imprint of godliness, is to tap into that small point within ourselves that is vital and has the capacity to give vitality to others as well. And he says, "V'ha'adam hadavuk b'nikuda zo, v'kol chiyuto nimshach achar zot hanikuda na'aseh shutaf b'ma'aseh breshit." Here he's kind of tying this back to the opening statements about creation, and is reminding us why we're talking about this today as we think about beginnings and the book of Breshit. He says, a person who is davuk b'nikuda, a person who clings to the nikuda, or maybe leans into, or sits with, or cultivates awareness of that small point of vitality within, nimshach achar zot hanekuda, is drawn in further toward that life force, essentially. Na'aseh shutaf ma'aseh breshit, that person becomes a partner in the act of creation. Na'aseh shutaf b'ma'aseh breshit becomes a partner in the act of creation. Right? So if the opening here was about the creation of the material world, you can see here that he is now kind of trying to bring us contemporaries into this creation story, and say that the creation story itself sort of serves as a metaphor of our mission in a way, right? It reminds us what we're here for. We're here to be creative, to be channels, let's say creative channels of divine creativity or divine energy. And the more we do that, the more we focus our attention and cultivate within our own nikuda. Again, I sort of welcome in any of the comments if anyone has like a better translation, or maybe one that resonates in a lingo that perhaps is accessible to more of you through mindfulness practice, let's say, right? If there is a parallel term for the life force within that generates passion, that generates action, that generates a sense of like alignment with the universe, let's say, or attunement, right? He says the more we lean into that, the more chiyus we get, the more life force we experience, the more we get put out into the world. And so that means the world itself benefits, right, through added energy, right? And in so doing, he says, we become shutafim, partners in creation, right? So the story of creation itself becomes, again, a kind of charge for us as human beings to lean into creativity and to continue to build the. Okay, I'm gonna leave out the last sentence because again, it sort of rests on proof text. So with that, I'm gonna now just go back to the chat. And I'm hoping that we might be able to have even a little bit of your voices in here. So let me see if I can just pull out some questions. Okay, so there's a question from Rabbi Lisa Hochberg-Miller. When the Zohar says God looked into Torah and created the world, what Torah was God looking into? Brilliant question. So first of all, I wish I could see you. If you waved, maybe I could find you on my screen. Okay, I don't know where you are. Maybe your camera's not even on. Oh yeah, I do see you. Hi. You're on the bottom of my screen. So Rabbi Lisa, that was a brilliant reading because you read into what was not so explicit here, right? Which is, there is a Zoharic statement that God looked into the world, into the Torah and created the world. Astakla be oraita, the something alma, maybe you don't know. Anyway, right? So God looked into the Torah. So this is another wonderful instance where the Sfat Emet is taking something that has, I don't want to suggest that there's like one meaning and then he departs from it, but it's hard to say about the Zohar that anything is the like simple meaning, but let's just go for it, right? The simple meaning of that phrase would be something like there's a Torah, like an architectural template almost, and out of that, right, God got the rules for making the world. Obviously that is simplistic and doesn't really mean anything, but the point is that the Sfat Emet sees something profoundly other there, which is, what does it mean to say that God looked into the Torah and created the world? God looked into the lives of people and out of that created Torah, which is to say that there is no Torah that precedes human beings, right? We're co-creators of this enterprise which we call Torah, but that's kind of the maybe specific pathway of living with awareness, living with holiness, living with aliveness, sort of putting out there different ways of interpreting that. But I hope, Rabbi, wherever you are now, so that's not an answer, but it does at least help to highlight what I think you're highlighting, which is the kind of amazing claim that the Sfat Emet is making, which is God looked into human lives and out of that created, or with that, in tandem with that, put in motion a world of co-creation, let's say. That's a wild statement. Right. And it also does mean that this thing called oral Torah, or Torah of life, breath of Torah, Torah of the mouth or of the body, right? It itself precedes, again, in time and maybe in priority as well, the written Torah, which gives like a whole new valence, I hope, to the centrality of human beings in the world, and the ways that our actions and our reflections and our channeling of kind of divine energy and creativity are actually seen again as constitutive of the world itself. Okay, thank you. What is this aliveness I am? Is it not the holy blessed one? I don't quite understand that question, but if the broader question, that what is aliveness and what is the Nakuda? Fair question. We're going to keep on kind of developing that, right? So I've thrown out some possible, translations But of course, that just begins to skim the surface of what we could mean to actually, lean into our points of aliveness or points of attunement, or right. I imagine that many of you have practices that already might attempt to do that. And here's a kind of new way of framing, perhaps, some of the practices of centering that you might already have. Small voice within, consciousness, those are all great. Neshama, thank you. Okay, wonderful. Let me pause there. Forgive me, I'm scanning the chat, and so I might have overlooked a question or a comment. So please do forgive me, but we do have a few minutes, and I'm going to ask Adi to help me here. And let's see if we can use that hand raising signal, under that reactions. And if anybody wants to raise a hand and actually then speak. Here we are talking so much about Torah Shebe'al Peh. I'd like to hear some. So I'd love to hear anybody's thoughts, reactions, questions, or challenges for this opening thought on Breshit, beginnings and creativity. So I'm going to call on a person who's just named iPad. How am I supposed to know your name? Hi.
Hi. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm Kim. Sorry. It identifies me as iPad.
Okay.
It's ridiculous. If you knew me, I'm not at all social. He thinks that's really funny. The only question I've been for the last year. I've been reading Pashas every week, and I read the discussions. And of course, as I'm doing it's all on my own. So I've got like a million questions, it's like, this is crazy. I can't believe that interpretation. But then you read about, something else. So today, instead of, I guess I thought maybe more you would, kind of go through the Pasha, the actual Pasha. And then, we discuss it, but you are discussing the first one, creation. It's just in a different way. So I wasn't sure, is this?
Okay. So just a note about my intentions for this class is I will be focusing on whatever the Sfat Emet is focusing on that week. So we'll always be doing something from the Parsha, and this is good feedback for me. If you want me, I definitely can, devote even just a few minutes to talking in its own context about what's going on in the Parsha itself, and then we'll focus on the particular read of the Sfat Emet for that week.
Yeah, okay, that'd be great. Yep,
okay.
That'd be great.
My pleasure. Other questions or feedback or comments? Barbara Stock. Hi.
Barbara, if you could raise your hand. Oh, Janet. Here I see Janet. Derek has raised your hand.
I'm Barbara Stock. How was this received? This sounds so radical.
Great question.
How was it received as he was speaking it?
Okay, so great question. How shall I say this? Well, the beauty of, I would say Hasidic tradition, but I don't think it's actually exclusively Hasidic, but Leib tradition has this amazing quality, right, of being spoken in context of relationship and community, right? So something that you can rely on when you're reading a Hasidic text, right, is that there is a relationship in place between teacher and student. And I say that, again, not because that's, again, exclusive to, Hasidic teaching, but I do think it is a purposeful, the teacher, the relationship itself is part of the teaching. So when you ask how it's received, my response to you is recognize that this is a Rebbe who has a following. So yes, I'm glad that you can hear it as radical, because I do think it is radical to say some of these things. Radical in the sense departs from some of the more traditional understandings. And one could also imagine that when set in a context of a very live, ongoing relationship, these words could be received, and they could be received well. And just one thing to note about the construction of this book itself, I mentioned at the beginning that these are words that were spoken by the Rebbe, right? So it's Torah shebe'al peh. They were spoken, and what we have are essentially his notes. So I should have maybe even emphasized that more in the beginning. Like, so if when I'm reading it, it sounds very truncated and odd and maybe elliptical to you, that's because it is. And the job of the reader is to kind of decode that. What he actually said, what we don't, this is not a transcription of what he said, it's a transcription of the notes that he took that his own students then preserved. Right? So you can see the relationship itself is kind of preserved and manifest in, right, the creation of the book itself. So that was a long way of saying I think it was received well, received enough to be, kept for posterity, written down by the Rebbe, but published by students who wanted to see these words continue, even when the particular relationship between that Rebbe and that Rebbe's students could no longer be experienced. Okay. Adi, how do you want to work this? I can call on people who have their hands up. Does that help?
Yeah, that sounds great. We also have 4 minutes left.
Okay. Martha Gunsberg, go ahead.
Like Barbara, I feel like this turns things absolutely topsy-turvy. My head is spinning because, we're all brought up with this sort of linear view. First, the world is created, the stages of the world, then there's Adam and Eve, then there's other generations, and on and on. And what you're saying, that the Torah was created, that the Torah came out of people. So were people created first and their actions? It's like my head is spinning. Good.
I feel mission accomplished. Not because God forbid, want people to leave confused, but because it really is head spinning. It really is a complete inversion of what one would ordinarily think, right? Again, this distinction, I don't know if the terminology of Torah shebe'al and Torah shebe'al peh is helpful or not to you, but if it is something that has associations with you in your mind, you recognize the absolute audacity of suggesting that Torah shebe'al is this little small thing that, essentially can be sidelined or doesn't even have a place in there's a whole book that is co-created by human beings, co-created in and out of the lives of human beings, that precedes all the laws and all of that stuff that is secondary. So yes, it is mind-blowing. And again, I hope that you'll come back. So that we can continue to tease it out together, because by no means did we cover it all. Just like he just gave, this is a small paragraph, right? In a large book, this is like his opening shot, so to speak. And there's just a whole lot more to come. So I'm just sort of affirming that if you're confused, then that means that in a way you have understood, and that we will continue, I hope, to understand more the implications of what it is that he's saying on our own lives and our understanding of what sort of Torah is and Torah life. Okay, we have 2 minutes left. So I'm sorry, but we'll just take one more question from Janet Derrick.
My question is a little bit with not understanding some of the Hebrew phrases that you're using. And could you write up sort of because I'm trying to take notes, and I said, what is that word? I don't even know how to spell it. I need a crib sheet for next Thursday's session that I could access ahead of time, just so okay, thank you.
Absolutely. I need a little bit more guidance there. Words like Torah shebe'al, those big things. Okay.
Yes.
Got it.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm going to do that.
And what is the title of this book that you're referring to? I don't.
Oh, I'm so sorry, everyone. I assumed that was all part of this sign up. Okay. I'm going to do better for next week.
Oh, maybe it was. I might have missed it. This is wonderful. Wonderful.
The book is called the
Hold it up.
Safat Emet, and I'm going to hold on one second. So this is the English version, but I have to warn you, called The Language of Truth. This is this thick book here is just selections that wonderful Professor Art Green put together, but I am not going to rely exclusively on it. But anything that I do want to reference, I will translate. So that's just a way of saying that if you want to get the book, that's totally great, but it will not exhaust all the text that I hope to reference over the course of the year, but I will definitely provide everything, including more explanations and a crib sheet. So I will be happy to offer that. I don't know if this is kind of the orthodox way of doing things in this setting, but I'm going to give you all my email address right now and say that if anybody would like to email me any questions or particular feedback for the coming week, you are most welcome to do so. And I look forward to seeing you all, I hope, back soon in a week from today. So do feel free to use that email and to share anything you want. And thanks so much. It's really been a pleasure to meet so many of you this way.